Have you ever set an alarm for 5 in the morning with genuine determination? The night before, you truly believe that tomorrow will be different. You picture yourself waking up early, doing something for yourself, for your future. But then the alarm goes off. You open your eyes for a few seconds, and that familiar hand reaches out and presses the snooze button. When you wake up again, the sun is already high. The clock says almost 8. And in your mind, there is a feeling you know very well. Not exactly laziness, but guilt. Guilt for breaking a promise you made to yourself. Maybe you've read somewhere that successful people wake up early. Maybe you've tried. Once, twice, maybe even more than that. But then a busy life pulls you back into the old rhythm. You tell yourself, "I'm just not a morning person." And the story ends there. But what if that isn't entirely true? What if the first hour of the morning doesn't just shape your day, but quietly shapes your entire life? The story you're about to hear isn't about someone who started out successful. It's the story of an ordinary man living in an ordinary city in Canada. A man who once had very little until 5 in the morning became the choice that changed everything. The man in this story is named Michael. He is 46 years old. He lives alone in a small industrial town in Canada, where life moves in steady repetition, like the freight trains that pass through every night. Michael works the night shift as a security guard at a distribution warehouse on the edge of the city. The job isn't physically demanding, but it is long and solitary. When most people are heading home after dinner, his shift begins. And when the city wakes up, when coffee shops open and the streets start to fill, Michael quietly finishes another long night. He rents an old apartment, warm enough in winter, cool enough in summer. Nothing more than that. The furniture is simple, so familiar it has almost become invisible. Michael's life isn't lacking, but there is also nothing to look forward to. What weighs on him most isn't money. It's the feeling that he has been trying for a long time, and yet everything remains exactly the same. Michael isn't lazy. He goes to work consistently. He causes no trouble. He avoids no responsibility. But at this stage of his life, he has begun to recognize a difficult truth. If nothing changes, then 10 years from now, his life will likely look exactly as it does today. And it is that thought, not physical exhaustion, that weighs on him each morning as he steps away from another night shift. Each morning, as Michael leaves the warehouse and steps outside, the city is just beginning its day. The air is still cool. The light is strong enough to see the road ahead, but not strong enough to chase the weariness from his body. He walks to the bus stop and stands quietly among people waiting for their first ride of the day. They wear neat coats. They hold hot cups of coffee. They talk about their plans. Some laugh. Some glance at their watches, already in a hurry. And Michael stands there in silence, as if he is moving at a different rhythm from the rest of the world. On the way home, he often looks at the lit windows he passes. Inside are family breakfasts, children getting ready for school, lives unfolding according to another schedule. Not better, just different. And it is that difference that makes his chest feel heavy. He asks himself, where did I go wrong? He has shown up for work year after year. He hasn't wasted money. He hasn't caused trouble. Yet it feels as if time is moving past him rather than moving with him. When Michael reaches his quiet apartment, he lies down just as the world outside is waking up. And in the moment before sleep takes him, a familiar thought returns. Is it still possible to live differently? If you've ever had a morning like this, you can leave a comment with the number 1. No explanation needed. Just a small sign to remind you. You are not the only one who has ever felt this way. One early winter morning, as Michael finished his night shift and walked toward the bus stop, his phone vibrated inside his coat pocket. At that hour, calls were rare. He hesitated for a moment, then answered. It was his sister. Her voice wasn't calm like usual. She spoke quickly, and each word fell heavily into the silence. Come home right away. Mom collapsed this morning. She's at the hospital. Michael stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. People kept walking past him. Cars continued to move. But in that moment, everything around him seemed to slow down. He didn't ask many questions. He said only one sentence. I'm coming. The trip home took more than 3 hours. Through the window, familiar scenery moved backward. Open fields, narrow roads he had left behind many years ago. He realized it had been a long time since he'd gone home. Not because he was busy, but because he didn't want to face the feeling that he still hadn't gotten anywhere. In the small hospital room, his mother lay quietly on the bed, thinner than he remembered. She was awake, but weak. The doctor said she was exhausted. She needed rest, medication, and regular care. Things that sounded simple, but Michael understood clearly. All of it required money and time. The two things he had always been short on. When they were alone, she held his hand very tightly. Her voice was soft, but steady. I don't have as much time as I used to. Don't spend your whole life just enduring it. If you can still change, then do it. Michael didn't answer right away. But for the first time in many years, he felt something inside him begin to crack. Michael stayed by his mother's hospital bed for a long time after she had fallen asleep. The room was quiet. Only the steady sound of the heart monitor filled the small space. He looked at her thin hands, hands that had worked all her life, cared for her family, and quietly grown old without ever asking for anything for herself. A difficult realization settled in. His mother's life and his own, in different ways, were strangely similar. Both had worked hard. Both had endured, so neither had truly had the chance to stop and build a life that felt complete. Michael stepped out into the hospital hallway. The automatic glass doors closed softly behind him, leaving him in the stillness of the early morning. The clock on the wall showed exactly 5 o'clock. Outside it was still dark. The air was cold and clear. The parking lot was nearly empty. A few people had already begun their day. A cleaner, a nurse changing shifts, the quiet sweep of headlights passing by. The city was still asleep, but life had not completely stopped. Michael stood there for a long time. He wasn't making plans. He wasn't thinking about money. Only one feeling was forming inside him. Not sadness, but anger. Anger at how much time he had allowed to pass without doing anything different. He whispered, almost only for himself to hear, I can't keep living like this. And in that quiet moment before dawn, a decision was made. Not loudly, not dramatically, but strong enough to change the rest of his life. On the bus ride back to the city, Michael sat by the window, his hand still tightly holding the ticket. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, though the sunlight was still weak. The city slowly came into view after a long night, familiar and subdued. Across from him, A man slightly older than Michael was reading a book. His coat was neatly buttoned. His posture was straight. His expression calm, unhurried. What caught Michael's attention wasn't the book, but the time. The clock on the bus showed just after 6 in the morning. After hesitating for a few minutes, Michael spoke. Almost instinctively, he asked why the man was taking the bus so early. The man looked up and smiled. He said he always started his day early, not because his job required it, but because it was the quietest part of the day. A time before phones, before messages, before anyone needed anything from him. The conversation was brief, but every sentence held Michael's attention. The man listened as Michael described his routine, then spoke plainly. You're awake while the world sleeps, and asleep while the world is living. It's very hard to move forward that way. There was no judgment in his tone, just a truth spoken at the right moment. But when the bus stopped, the man left Michael a business card. He said that if Michael truly wanted to change, he would be willing to share more, but only if Michael was serious. Michael stepped off the bus with a strange feeling, not a surge of hope, just a possibility he had never considered before. Sometimes, change doesn't begin with a big plan, but with a single sentence spoken at the right time. That afternoon, Michael held the business card for a long time before making the call. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. He only knew that if he didn't do something different, everything would continue exactly as it was. And this time, that thought was impossible to ignore. They met at a small cafe near the bus terminal, quiet in the middle of the day. The man introduced himself as Daniel. He didn't talk much about himself. He didn't list any achievements. Instead, he asked Michael about a typical day, from the moment he woke up to the moment he went to sleep. Daniel listened very carefully. Then he took a piece of paper and drew a straight line. The problem isn't that you're not hardworking, he said. The problem is that you have no time for yourself when your mind is actually awake. He pointed to the hours between 5 and 7 in the morning. 2 hours when most people are either still asleep or not yet pulled into work, messages, and responsibilities. This is one of the few moments in the day when you can build your life, Daniel said, instead of just reacting to it. Michael frowned. 2 hours didn't sound like much. Daniel smiled and began to do the math. 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, 4 weeks a month. The numbers became clearer than Michael had ever imagined. You don't need to do anything big, Daniel said calmly. Just do one important thing, consistently, during those 2 hours. The rest will change on its own. Michael sat in silence. For the first time in many years, the advice didn't feel distant or unrealistic. It felt possible. Michael left the cafe with his mind full of thoughts. 2 hours every morning. The idea sounded simple, but when placed into his life, it felt far from easy. To have 2 clear hours in the morning, he would have to trade sleep, and to let go of habits he had carried for many years. That evening, Michael stared at the clock for a long time. 9 o'clock. Normally, he would stay up for hours, watching the news, scrolling on his phone until his eyes felt heavy. This time, he turned off the lights earlier than usual. There was no excitement, just a quiet decision. The alarm rang at 5 in the morning. There was no rush of motivation, only a tired body and a familiar voice in his head telling him to sleep a little longer. Michael sat up slowly, not because he felt inspired, but because he had told himself he would try, at least once. The apartment was still dark. The city outside was asleep. He made a cup of coffee and sat down at the small table near the window. No grand plans, no vague goals, just a rare moment of quiet where no one needed a response from him. Michael opened his laptop and began learning a basic skill he had once ignored because he was always too tired. The first minutes passed slowly, but in that silence, he realized something. This was the first time in the day he was doing something for his future, not just to survive. And even though that morning didn't change anything right away, it opened the door to a new rhythm of living, quiet, but completely different from before. After a few days of trying to wake up early, Michael met Daniel again. Not to show off any progress, just to say that this was harder than he had expected. Daniel listened, and then picked up a pen and wrote a few simple numbers on a piece of paper. "You're thinking of those 2 hours as a tiring morning," he said. "Try seeing them as time being accumulated. 2 hours a day, 14 hours a week, nearly 60 hours a month, and more than 700 hours a year." Daniel circled the final number. "That's almost 3 full months of work," he said, "just from waking up early." Michael stared at the numbers for a long time. For the first time. The thing he had always felt he was lacking became concrete. It was no longer a vague feeling slipping away day by day. It was something that could be gathered, used, and turned into something real. Daniel continued, his voice still calm. "The problem isn't that you're not capable," he said, "and it's not that it's too late. It's simply that, until now, you've never given enough clear, awake time to the things that truly matter." Michael didn't say anything, but in his mind, the quiet mornings of the past few days began to line up into its sequence. No longer scattered, no longer meaningless. They were starting to point somewhere. If at this moment you're realizing that how you use your time each day matters more than you once thought, you can leave a comment with the number 1. Not to commit to anyone else, just as a small sign to yourself that you've seen it. Daniel didn't call what he was about to say advice. He called it conditions. "You can try this," he said. "But if you wanted to truly change your life, there are 3 things that cannot be negotiated. The first, wake up at 5 every day. Not most days, not when you feel motivated, every day, including weekends." Daniel was clear. Allow yourself to break the rule even once, and your brain learns how to delay everything. The second, go to sleep before 9 at night. No exceptions. No late-night news. No scrolling on your phone until exhaustion takes over. You can't borrow sleep and still expect your body to function well, Daniel said. If you want to wake up early, you have to respect sleep first. The third, accept that the first week will be very hard. Your body will resist. Your mind will look for reasons to stop. Daniel didn't promise this would be easy. He simply told the truth. After about 3 weeks, your body will adapt. After a few months, it will become part of who you are. Daniel set a time frame, 90 days. No judging progress halfway through. No quitting early. After 3 months, he said, if you truly do everything we've talked about, your life will no longer look the same. Michael sat quietly, feeling the weight of what he had just heard. There were no flashy promises, only discipline, time, and patience. Things that aren't loud, but are very real. And for the first time in many years, he understood that this change wouldn't come from inspiration, but from repeating simple actions every single day. The alarm rang at 5 in the morning, not just once, but every day. And for Michael, the first week didn't feel like a fresh beginning at all. It simply felt exhausting. His body pushed back as early as the second day. His head felt heavy. His eyes burned. His steps around the small apartment were slower than usual. Each morning, as his hand reached for the phone, a familiar voice appeared in his mind. Just today. Sleeping a little longer won't hurt. But Michael didn't give in. Not because he felt strong, but because he had promised himself he wouldn't break the rule, at least for 90 days. The early morning hours passed painfully slowly. He sat in front of his computer, learning basic things he had always postponed because he was too tired. He didn't always understand. Some mornings, he had to read the same section over and over again. But he didn't stop. After that came 30 minutes of walking through the neighborhood while it was still quiet. No headphones, no fitness goals. Just letting his body keep moving, letting his mind become a little clearer. During the day, Michael caught up on sleep. At night, he returned to his shift as usual. The cycle repeated itself, heavy and lonely. No one knew what he was doing. No one encouraged him. But by the end of the first week, even though he was still very tired, Michael noticed something small. He had done something he used to quit every time. And that, not the results, began to change the way he saw himself. Around the 20th day, Michael noticed something small, but very clear. He began waking up before the alarm. Not exactly full of energy, but no longer fighting against it the way he had in the beginning. His body started working with him instead of against him. His mind felt lighter. Mornings were no longer a battle, but a structured, predictable time. Michael sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and realized he was understanding things more quickly. Concepts that once felt tangled began to connect, little by little. The walks changed too. They were no longer just to wake his body up. He began to notice the early light, the stillness of the neighborhood, while most people were still asleep. There was something different about moving through a moment when the world hadn't yet demanded anything from you. At work, a few people noticed the change. They said Michael looked healthier, more focused. He simply smiled. He didn't explain. This wasn't about proving anything. Michael completed his first course. It wasn't a major achievement, just a small milestone, but enough to show him that his morning time was creating real value. More importantly, he began to see himself differently. No longer as someone merely enduring life, but as someone quietly rebuilding it. If you've ever had a moment like this, when you realize you're changing, even very slowly, you can leave a comment with the number 1. Not to promise anyone else, just to acknowledge that you've begun. As the 3rd month began, Michael started doing something he had never considered before. He began applying what he had learned directly to his own job, not to impress anyone, just to see whether those quiet mornings were making a real difference. At the distribution warehouse, inventory was still being tracked in a scattered way. Michael looked at the familiar numbers and realized he could organize them more clearly. He spent a few mornings creating a simple spreadsheet. Nothing fancy, just enough to track quantities, delivery times, and the places where mistakes usually happened. One evening, he brought a printed copy with him to his shift. When the supervisor looked it over, they paused longer than usual. There was no loud praise, just a simple question. "You made this?" Michael nodded. He said he was learning and wanted to try improving the process. A few days later, the spreadsheet was put to use. Small errors began to decrease. The work flowed more smoothly. No one called it a big change, but Michael knew something important. For the first time in many years, he was creating value beyond the tasks he had been assigned. What mattered most wasn't the response from others, but the feeling inside him. Michael was no longer just getting through a shift. He was participating in his work, using new abilities he had quietly built each morning. And in that moment, he understood that small changes, repeated long enough, can open very real doors. One evening, near the end of his shift, Michael was called into the manager's office. He didn't feel anxious, only a quiet curiosity. He sat down in the familiar chair across from the manager he had worked with for many years. They talked about the warehouse, about the small, steady improvements over the past few weeks. Then the conversation shifted. The company was expanding its operations team. They needed someone who understood the warehouse and could handle basic data. The manager looked directly at Michael and asked, "Would you like to try this role?" Michael didn't answer right away, not because he was unsure, but because he needed a few seconds to realize this was real. The new position was a day shift, more responsibility, higher pay than his current role. Not a dramatic leap, but a step in the right direction. When he nodded, there was no applause, no moment of celebration, just a decision made in a very ordinary way, the way most lasting changes actually happen in real life. That evening, Michael called his mother. He didn't say much, only that his work would be different soon. On the other end of the line, she was silent for a moment, then said, "So you've started." Michael hung up the phone and sat alone in his quiet apartment. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel like he was running from time. He was moving with it, slowly but steadily. 1 year after Michael began waking up at 5 in the morning, his life hadn't turned into something extraordinary. He hadn't changed his life in the way people often talk about. But everything was clearly different. Michael now worked during the day. He rested in a rhythm that matched his body. Each early morning, he kept the same habit, not because he had to, but because it was time he chose for himself. He continued learning new skills, reading, thinking, and preparing for the day ahead in quiet. His mother's health was better, not because of a miracle, but because he was now able to care for her more consistently. Their phone calls were no longer filled with worry, but with ordinary conversations. Something small, yet deeply meaningful. Looking back, Michael understood something important. Changing your life doesn't begin with powerful motivation. It begins with rearranging your time, especially when your mind is at its clearest. 5 in the morning isn't a formula for success. It's simply a symbol of a choice, the choice to live with intention rather than just reacting to circumstances. You don't need to be like Michael. You don't need to wake up at 5 in the morning. What matters more is this. Do you have a time in your day that you've set aside to build your life? If this story made you pause for a few minutes, you can press like as a quiet way to show support. And if you'd like to hear more slow, reflective stories for those continuing forward in the second half of life, stay with the channel. Life doesn't ask you to start over. It only asks you to begin differently, starting tomorrow.